Dr. Trevino, Salvador.
Thank you,
And
Salvador.
I want to thank you, Angel, for the preface to this webinar. And you gave some very good information, very good resources for us to follow up, and also for others to follow up. Thank you so much. I want to also thank you for inviting me again to present part 2. And in order for me to provide continuity of learning, I just want to recap some of the key concepts that we covered last, our previous presentation, part 1. These are the important concepts that we're going to be carrying over, important conceptualizations that we apply to the actual patients that we see. The very first conceptualization that I would like to recap that we presented at the part 1 is our knowledge base. Our knowledge base is qualitative. It's phenomenological. It is the notion that knowledge can be constructed by listening to people describe their lived experiences. It is a very powerful tenet to my qualitative and philosophical approach to how I do psychotherapy with Latinos, and just how I do psychotherapy in general. The second tenet of qualitative phenomenological approaches is that people are experts in their lived experiences. If I want to understand how the pandemic is affecting my patients, I'm going to ask them. And while I listen to them describe their lived experiences, I am going to be cognizant that I am in a opportune place to begin to construct knowledge about how pandemia is affecting our community, how the pandemic is affecting the Latino community. The third tenet that is very, very important for me is that meanings change over time. There is a universal truth that is the minted currency of empirical science, very, very powerful. But from a qualitative science, there is a multiplicity of truths as meanings change over time. The person who comes to see you, who is feeling isolated because of the pandemic and social distancing, may have a particular meaning that they give their symptoms at the beginning of therapy. But at the end of therapy, that meaning has changed, is not the same. So that is very important for me to understand, that meanings change over time. There is a multiplicity of truths. There's not just a universal truth of empirical facts. There's also the multiplicity of qualitative truths as we experience our life and as we move through the daily stresses of living. Okay. The other key conceptualization that we want to carry over to part 2 is that we need to maintain, I work very hard to maintain the dialectic, the tension between the scientific approaches of the empirical science, cognitive behavioral therapy, and the qualitative approaches to science, psychodynamic therapy. It is both of those approaches. I try to maintain the tension of opposites because I need them to understand what's going on with my patients. I rely on careful observation. This is the scientific method. I rely on careful observation. I rely on my ability and skill to identify patterns as my patients are talking to me about their lived experiences. I utilize hypotheses. I utilize theory as instruments of critical thinking to help me focus and understand what my patients are telling me as they describe their reactions to social distancing, to the pandemic. Key concepts. Holding the tension of opposites is very, very important. And I want to make sure that I highlight that as we carry over and we talk about patients. The other key conceptualization that I would like to carry over from part 1 to part 2 is that loss loss and trauma can be cumulative. They may not present themselves in spectacular fashions, but they nevertheless exert tremendous pressure on our lived experiences. Losses can be cumulative. The significant losses in the past, when we experience losses in the present, it pulls the trauma from the past losses to the present. We keep that in mind as our patients talk to us about the losses of employment during pandemia, or as Dr. Orovich will be discussing, the loss of the ritual to be able to grieve if we lose someone to COVID-19. Multiple losses are pulled forward whenever we experience a contemporary significant loss. Key conceptualization there. Next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about very briefly about the population that I am referring to when I present my conceptualizations. I want to be talking about the presenting problems. Okay. I want to be going a little bit more into what matters to me when I'm working with Latinos, and those are the concepts of sacred space and the corrective emotional experiences, the insight that the sacred space provides. Sacred space referring to the relationship between me and my patient. In the process of doing that, we're going to be going over some culturally sensitive, culturally informed interventions. Okay? And then we'll end with conclusions with Q&A. Okay? Next slide, please. The patients that I want to be drawing from, the population that helps me develop my conceptualizations and my interventions, that helps me understand how the pandemic is affecting the Latino community. I draw from the clinical experience from GCAPS, Guadalupe Counseling and Psychological Services. It is a small private practice that's culturally informed in the unincorporated area of Santa Barbara near UCSB, the University of Santa Barbara, University of California in Santa Barbara. These services that we offer are based in evidence-based. They're anchored in evidence-based therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, but they are framed, they are held with the qualitative approaches to the understanding of human experiences. And that's the phenomenological approach. The patients that we see, the patients that help me develop my conceptualizations, come to GCAPS with a variety of presenting problems. They come with family conflicts. They come with substance abuse and domestic violence, pre-existing conditions, if I use that term, psychologically. Whenever there are stresses, you're going to see an increase in pre-morbid diagnosis, pre-conditions like domestic violence. If there was domestic violence prior to the pandemic, you're going to see an increase in that. Just look at the statistics. Look at the statistics around child abuse, spousal abuse, alcohol abuse. All of that is going through the roof. These are the presenting issues that the patients that come to GCAPS bring with them. They come with stresses related to unemployment. They come with stresses related to underemployment. They come with stresses related to overcrowding. Some of the patients that we see at GCAPS live in families where there are multiple families living in small quarters. Now, try to have some privacy when you are forced to live under those conditions because you have limited resources. They come because of immigration, acculturation stress. They come because of behavioral problems with their children. More commonly, the very first presenting issue is not the pandemic, is not the response to the pandemic, but something that has already been in existence, something that has already been there. And most often, it is issues around matters of the heart. There is the love has gone wrong. Una persona tiene el corazón espinado tiene el corazón quebrado. There's infidelity that's involved in some of these relationships. These are the presenting issues. The presenting issues, as we understand them, are now being exacerbated because of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Okay. The psychological space. When I pick up the phone and I call you, and I want to make an appointment, the minute I hear your voice and the minute you ask my name and what the problem is that you can be helping me with, it creates a psychological space. It creates a space that is characterized by vulnerability. It is characterized by a great deal of anxiety. Now, I'm going to propose to you that anxiety is a marker for an ordinary spiritual space. By spiritual space, I'm referring to those moments when we are in awe, when we cannot talk about something that is so powerfully meaningful to us, something that has impacted us. That's a spiritual space. So that is something that I'm going to be advancing here. It is the emotional space. The sacred space is the emotional space. The feelings that I have when you call my name y me dice, ¿cómo estás, Salvador? ¿Qué me puede decir? ¿Cómo le fue? As soon as I hear your voice, I enter into an emotional space because tears are already in my eyes. I'm holding my breath. My body is reacting to the fact that you're listening to me. That's the emotional space that I'm very, very sensitive to. That's the sacred space. Okay? It is the space that the patients see when they zoom into their session and they see you. Okay? The minute they see you, there is an emotional reaction to what's happening in their screen. That's the emotional space. That is the sacred space that I'm referring to. Okay? Key conceptualization. That is where the miracle occurs of psychotherapy. The next slide, please. Okay. Sacred space refers to the intimate interaction between the clinician and the patient. The very first time they call you, the very first time cuando preguntan, ¿usted es el doctor Treviño? Necesito que hablar con usted porque tengo un problema muy grande. ¿Me puede ayudar? Me recomendó mi amiga Chapa. Okay. As soon as they begin to talk and disclose and talk about why they're talking to you, okay, that's an intimate interaction. That is sacred space. It is the dialectic between two objects, two people, that the minute they begin the conversation, meaning is created. The minute you reach out to your patient and you say, fíjese que sí tengo una hora que sí le puedo ofrecer a usted para seguir la plática. The minute you arrange for an appointment, it begins what's referred to as the corrective emotional experience. It begins to lift the depression. It begins to release some of the tension of unresolved grief. They may even begin to cry, or their voice begins to shake as symptoms of mourning, as a marker of mourning. The losses now are beginning to be addressed. That's sacred space. It is a place where therapia, where tears, las lágrimas, la agua de limpieza, when that begins to flow and the wounds and the soul begins to grieve, okay? That's what I'm referring to. Next slide, please. Okay. Key conceptualization is that in honoring the sacred space, you are establishing the therapeutic alliance as the agent of change. Now, this is a conceptualization that I'm not just pulling out of my ear. It is a conceptualization that is backed up by research. The therapeutic alliance is the sole agent of change. Esa es la medicina. Esa es la cosa que cambia la persona. Esa es la cosa que sana el corazón, que está espinado. The therapeutic alliance is the sole agent of change, not the theory. That's just an instrument of critical thinking. okay? Not the techniques that come from that particular theory. Those are just interventions based on critical thinking, but it is what flows between you and your patient. That's the therapeutic alliance. To create the therapeutic alliance, to contribute to it, it is to have a shared worldview with your patient that you understand. Cuando la persona te dice, no, pues me siento bien gacho porque me corrieron por la cosa con este COVID que está pasando, ya me quitaron el trabajo. For you to understand what it's like for someone to take away your sole source of income and what that means to you, your value as a human being, how that impacts your relationship and your family, is having a shared worldview with your patients. Establishing yourself as a credible, properly trained, knowledgeable clinician contributes significantly to instilling a sense of hope and confidence in your patient. That's part of the therapeutic alliance. Promoting the idea that change is possible. Esos son esperanzas. That's hope. That is the beginning. No? You start with promoting that idea by supporting that your patient called you, looked for you, went out of the way to listen to someone, give them your name and your telephone number, and for them to call you. That is the beginning of hope. And I am sure that when that happens and I see that, the first glimpse, I reinforce that. Next slide, please. Some of the psychosocial stressors. Now, I want to share something about this gentleman that's behind me. He was very kind. I asked him, can I take a photo with you? And he says, sure. And he allowed me to take this photo of him. Okay. But I wanted to point out that this right here captured unintentionally. Okay. He didn't want to stand next to me out of his safety. He wanted to stand behind me. But unintentionally, when this photo, when I saw this photo later on, it really symbolized the psychosocial stressors of what's impacting and exacerbating the responses to the pandemic. And that's the psychosocial stressors, the social justice issues that are going on right now. The way people look at you because you wear a mask, something as commonsensical as wearing a mask during a public health crisis has now been politicized, and people get threatened for wearing a mask. That's a significant psychosocial stressor that is not paranoia, that is based on fact, that contributes to the exacerbation of the reactions to the pandemic. Okay, next slide, please. This was the 1930s. It's a repeat of what's going on now. In El Paso, has one of the highest rates of COVID-19 in the world. The Army, the military, is now supplementing the medical staff because they are so overwhelmed. Latinos and Blacks are being targeted because we are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Okay. Significant stressor hasn't changed. The stressors are exacerbated. Pre-existing traumata, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, wrongs that have been done to the community that continue, that are passed on from generations to generations, are being exacerbated by the crisis of the pandemic. Next slide, please. These are the patients. This is what my patients look like. These are not my patients. Pero así se ven, así es la gente. Llegan con sus hijos. Very stressful to reach out, very stressful to make an appointment. And then once they make an appointment, try to conduct telecounseling when there's only one phone in the family and there's only 2 bedrooms in the family. No? When the cell phone kind of goes in and kind of goes out. Not having privacy to address some of the issues that are surfacing. Some of the causes as to why they're calling you. Very, very stressful. Okay. These are the real people that we're talking about. Not some hypothetical, not some abstract patient, but real people. And that's why I want to ground this in real life events. Next slide, please. The internalization of traumatic experiences may lead the individual and groups of individuals, groups of people to become ill, physically, emotionally, and psychologically. Intergenerational trauma contributes to the prevalence rate of depression, of substance abuse, of domestic violence, of behavioral conduct problems, of learning disabilities. The internalization of traumatic experiences. These traumata can be activated and exacerbated by the social stressors of the coronavirus pandemic. Some of the young teenagers that I see through telecounseling are very, very disillusioned because of distance learning, being at home. They had a hard time going to school to begin with, and now the added stress of distance learning. Try to attend school when there's another family in the kitchen where it's the only place where you can sit down and attend school online and they're cooking. Stresses, no? The reactions to the pandemic may manifest as loss of self-confidence, loss of initiative, substance abuse, domestic violence, and other self-destructive behaviors. And I think this concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Trevino, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to our participants for taking the time to join us. Today, as Dr. Trevino mentioned, I'll be following up on the previous presentation we did on September. And at that time, I presented the dual process model of grief, which is a person-centered approach to grief psychotherapy. And it is consistent with the philosophical knowledge base that we have been presenting on the previous webinar and now on this one. So next slide, please. So my goal for presenting this case is to increase awareness of cultural expressions of grief and the role of rituals in a therapeutic process among mental health providers, of course, all of you here today. And then the specific objectives on the next slide, as you'll see, include the identification of Latino expressions of grief in, it says clinical cases, but it is a clinical case, discussing rituals as they relate to loss and grief in Latinos. And we will address, as Dr. Trevino mentioned, the importance of the therapeutic relationship in psychotherapy and, of course, in a grieving process. So our next slide. I will not be presenting those on that order, but those are the 3 main areas that I want to address today. And if you have any questions, feel free to, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to ask some questions using the Q&A. So for today's presentation, I have modified some of the information of the case, of course, to protect the confidentiality of the person that we will be speaking about today. So to give you some information, Elena is a 40-year-old female from Puerto Rico who works as an administrative assistant. She comes to therapy after the loss of her partner of a little over 10 years. The circumstances of the loss remain unclear to this day, as he had a liver condition for which he had some symptoms. He went to the hospital, he was improving during the hospital stay, and then suddenly took a turn for the worse. And then he was put in the ICU, and unfortunately, he passed away a few days later. As I mentioned, they had been together for a little over 10 years, and she describes the relationship as a good relationship. As a result of this, she has lost her appetite. She's lost a significant amount of weight. I would say it was about 20 pounds in 2 or 3 weeks. She cried frequently, expressed a feeling of sadness, difficulty sleeping, some disturbing dreams. Right now, she lives with her mother, and she describes a positive relationship with her mother as well, having good communication. So in the next slide, we'll see some of the symptoms that she was presenting at the beginning of the process. I have to say that this was right at the beginning of the pandemic. So we are speaking mid-March was when we began this process. And her partner had passed away right at the beginning of March. And I am not seeing my screen. Am I back? Angel, can you confirm that you can see me and listen and hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and now you're moving back again.
Okay, because I wasn't seeing the presentation for a few seconds. So some of the presenting symptoms included, as I mentioned, changes in her sleep pattern, loss of appetite, crying spells, loss of interest in everyday activities, intrusive thoughts about her partner's death. And then I should mention that at the beginning, as I mentioned, this was right at the beginning of the pandemic. So at that point, she wasn't working. We had all the safety measures in place, and her office had been closed for a period of time since March up until the end of May, beginning of June. So in our next slide, we'll see some other relevant information regarding this case. Dr. Trevino mentioned how during loss processes, one of the things that may come up is that other losses, because loss is cumulative, as he mentioned. So we had as relevant information the fact that she lost her father 4 years ago. And we also have, of course, the impact of the pandemic on usual rituals that we use to move through grieving processes. So for her process, it included the fact that the body had to be cremated. There was no wake. The burial is still pending. And another loss that was the result of the pandemic is the fact that she wasn't working at the time, and that was signified as a loss for her. So during the next slide, I'll be speaking about the therapeutic relationship. And if you remember, during our last session, we spoke about how the therapeutic relationship, the axiom that it is the relationship that heals. And we know that during a grieving process, it is so important to have a safe and empathic relationship with a reliable caregiver, one where you feel understood and supported through the loss journey, and when you are allowed to have the experience of loss and to recognize the inner experiences which is, of course, part of the organismic valuing process. In this case, and as Dr. Trevino mentioned, the therapeutic relationship began with the first phone call, right? That's where we begin to provide the space for the grieving to take place. So what are some of the considerations that I had in mind for this process, and given the fact that we were beginning the pandemic? So during that call, some of the things that we discussed was the fact that it was going to be virtual, that our meetings were going to be virtual, and it was important, and it still is, to be flexible. And that means being flexible in terms of what platform we were going to use, what days we were going to meet, what hours we were going to meet. So I sent her via email a authorization form where we included some of the issues regarding telehealth. So that was our first meeting. That was through that call. And then during our first virtual encounter, we discussed the authorization form. It was important to, again, go over that. What are the limits of confidentiality? What are some of the limits regarding virtual meetings? Because as we know, we may use headphones, we may use earbuds, but maybe our participants don't have those. And then that means that in the space where they're at, the conversation of what you're saying might be heard by someone else, and it is important to discuss all of those elements. So another element that I took into consideration regarding the therapeutic relationship was safety. And when I speak of safety, I speak of the physical space and also the emotional space. It is important for our participants to feel safe in order to share with us some of their inner experiences and the meanings. So as you'll see here, I'm at my office right now offering the webinar, and I have, for example, so being mindful of the physical space was one of the things that I took into consideration. And here, as well as in my other space at home, I have some elements that are important and that I sometimes provide safety for participants. For example, here I have a cross, and I think about 90+% of the people I see practice some form of Christianity. So that is a connection that they immediately feel, that allows them to feel safe in sharing some of their experiences. I don't want to forget anything. So those were some of the considerations that were taken for this relationship to start building the alliance. Also, it is important to note that during the pandemic, providers as well as our participants, we are experiencing some of the losses that our participants are experiencing. So it is important, and it has been important for me to recognize my own losses, previous and current due to the pandemic, to be aware of what they mean to me, to be empathic to the losses of others, and to realize that even though I am connecting with them and providing an empathic relationship, that's not my experience, right? Dr. Trevino was saying how every participants are the experts of their experiences, and it is important for us to keep that boundary where we are empathic and we recognize our own experiences, but we also allow them to have a space to share them without them conflicting or being confused. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our last webinar, we spoke about the dual process model. And again, this is a person-centered model. And we spoke about the oscillation between the loss and the restoration orientations. One of the things that we mentioned is that it is important to allow for these expressions to occur, and then to allow them to be expressed in a balanced and flexible manner. So if that happens, we are moving forward in the loss journey. So that means some of the expressions that were part of the loss orientation included things such as, how did this happen? He died by himself. I wasn't there. And those are two very different expressions. One is the idea that her partner was alone at the time of his death, and the other has to do with her role in that process, with her not being present, with her not being able to hold his hand and to accompany him in this journey, and the emotions that brought about. The other expressions that are reflective of the loss orientation, with things such as life is unfair. And another important one was the fact that she questioned not only the causes of the loss, but also the fact that this was a young person who was otherwise healthy, and then the natural process of life did not take place. And this was important to her to reflect on how this is different than the previous loss, significant loss she had had with her father, because her father suffered from a serious condition. He was an older man, so that seemed natural. This didn't. And also on top of that, loss over loss over loss, we have the fact that she was experiencing disenfranchised grief because she wasn't able to put into place the rituals that she would usually, or her family would usually put into place to move through the journey. I don't want to miss anything, so okay. So then in the process, we went from the loss expressions then to the restoration orientation, and some of that included, so we would move from one to the other. I also want to mention that other expressions of loss included the crying spells, the loss of appetite, and the other ways, not just verbally, the other ways that the loss was expressed, right? So I want to mention that as well. So then the restoration orientation had to do with things such as finding comfort in family. His family, his brothers were very supportive. Finding comfort in coworkers. It was one of her coworkers who referred her to the process, and becoming aware of her inner dialogue. So her inner dialogue moved from the expressions of unfairness, of uncertainty, to expressions of which reflected her being hopeful. She started doing exercise. As she reincorporated herself into working, that was very significant. Establishing boundaries with her coworkers, letting them know, if I feel a certain way, I'm going to take my time. I'm going to move away from the office for a bit, and I hope you are respectful of that. And that happened. Exercise, working, being able to socialize in safe ways, taking into consideration the pandemic. So that was part of the process in terms of the dual process model. And now I want to go into the rituals in the next slide. So Elena is a Catholic person. She practices the Catholicism, and some of the rituals that were impacted by the pandemic, as I mentioned previously, included the fact that her partner was cremated. And as we spoke about this and what that meant for her, she came to mention that it was a sort of, it was a bargain. So this wasn't ideal. This wasn't what it wasn't what she or the family wanted. But she was able to bargain how, well, the Vatican recognizes that cremation does not touch the soul, and that was important to recognize. And that there are certain circumstances where cremation is acceptable for the Catholic Church, including economic reasons, including social reasons, and including hygienic or health reasons. So that information, as she processed it, allowed her to accept and to transform the experience of the loss and the way that all the events afterward took place. In terms of the rituals, or the other rituals, we have the wake, and the wake is a space for prayers and words of sympathy and praise are shared, right, between family members. And so it was significant for her and the family. What they did is that they've been keeping the ashes at the place where he will eventually be buried once safety measures are changed and more family members can attend, because this is a big family. So they go once a month. They go to the place with their mask and being careful with all the safety measures. They meet where the ashes are kept, and they share stories and they share feelings regarding the loss, and this has been very significant for her. And then in terms of the rosary, well, the rosary promotes plenary indulgence. This is some of the information that she was sharing in terms of what these rituals have meant for her in the past. It is a way for you to help your loved one move into heaven. So as you know, Catholics, you go into purgatory and then you can move to heaven. And if you pray the rosary, this is a way for you to help your loved one go into heaven. You commend your loved one to God and you ask the Virgin Mary for indulgence. So recognizing that wasn't going to happen the way she wanted or the way that she would have done it otherwise, the transformation here was that they did the rosary virtually. So this is very significant and very healing that she was able to do this in this way. So next slide, please. So in terms of, I mentioned 3 areas that we will be speaking about. It was a therapeutic relationship, the expressions of grief, and then the rituals. I include these questions even though we've been through the presentation, but I'll go briefly and then we can have our Q&A. So the first one is identify to Latino cultural values or traditions that may contribute or hinder the resolution of the patient's anxiety, and spirituality is one of them. And it was both. In the beginning, it was conflicting because she couldn't practice the rituals that they had been used to, but the transformation took place, and then of course it has been contributing to the. And then familismo, because the support has been so significant in process. The actual implied loss, well, the actual loss is the loss of her partner, and then there's the loss of the rituals, the loss of her routine because she wasn't working at the time, the loss of structure, the loss of control, and then I think those are some of the secondary losses that resulted from the pandemic. And then expressions of grief and sadness included crying, verbal expressions, again, the loss of appetite, and the changes in the sleep pattern. And our next slide. So I think we went over the value of rituals in facilitating grief, mourning, and the resolution of loss. And as you can see, being a Catholic person, rituals were so important and had meanings that are so important to her, and the fact that they were able to transform these rituals was significant in the resolution. I mean, it's a process and it's continuing, but it has been very valuable. And the cultural rituals that can facilitate the expression of grief and mourning, I included the wake, the rosary, and eventually the burial. So that's my presentation. If Dr. Trevino, if you want to add anything, let me know. And Otherwise, we can go into our Q&A.
I just want to add a couple of conceptualizations, some associations. The presentation that you gave was excellent. I think that the illustration gives us an opportunity to see how culture and clinical process intervene or interact. And I think that was one of the takeaways for me. My association to the case itself was that of complicated bereavement, and the complicated bereavement was for me was highlighted by a depressive state, and this is from a scientific empirical science perspective. This is the tension of opposites that I'm referring to. That the loss of appetite is a loss of desire. That is a hallmark for depression. Loss of weight, which is impacting the soma, which are positive signs of something more severe than sadness. So that is another marker for depression. The crying spells of Elena would indicate to me that it is a wet depression as opposed to a dry depression where there is listlessness. So there is a great deal of emoting going on. Some of the associations to the concept of rituals. Rituals provide the containment. Rituals provide the process and the structure to create meaning, to facilitate grief, to tell and retell the memories of the person that you lost. I think that is quite significant. Elena's loss is one of two of the most critical losses that anybody could experience, and that is the loss of a spouse, although they were not married, or I'm not sure if the vignette said that they were married, but they were together for 10 years. That's a significant loss. The other significant loss that appears to be irreparable is the loss of an offspring, the loss of a child. I think that creating meaning gives form to loss, and that's one of the functions of ritual. So when Dr. Orovich restored the rituals to facilitate the grieving, she allowed for meaning to be created, which then soothes the soul when it experiences a significant loss. And this is my last comment, the difference between grief and mourning. Grief is the physical sensation of the loss. Las lágrimas, el dolor del corazón. No puedo dormir, no tengo ganas de comer. All of that are markers of grief. The expressions of all of that is what we call mourning. The public expressions, what we can see, is the mourning. Ese es el luto.
And then the fact that it is expressed, it happens in a cultural context for that exact reason, because we express it, so it is shared with others.
A culturally informed intervention, in this particular case with Elena, would speak to catharsis, allowing her to cry and allowing her to come to a natural pause in her grief, and then to begin to engage the thinking processes as a way of drying her out, as a way of creating meaning. Culturally informed interventions, the value of catharsis, the value of a corrective emotional experience that the rituals provided.
Thank you. So with that, should we go into the Q&A?
Con mucho gusto.
Okay, Salvador, do you think you could turn on your video so we can see you? There you go.
Aquí estoy. No nos tienen preguntas.
Aquí estoy. Gracias. Thank you, Daddies, and Dr. Salvador Treviño for a wonderful presentation. As always, very informative and full of great material for our audience to apply with their participants. I'm looking here through the questions, and I'm trying to to identify besides all the great comments on congratulating you on this presentation. I have here a question that says, can you talk more about the acculturation stress? As school counselor, how can I explain it to the teachers in their school?
One of the ways that I work with the school district is to make myself available, to make GCAPs available, to be consultants, to troubleshoot with the faculty at the elementary, junior, and high school level, even at the university level. But one of the acculturation stresses that I help when that's the issue, I parallel that to the child that is having difficulty adjusting. You have the adjustment period, the difficulty in transitioning from home to school as the acculturation on a more micro level. So I use that as a parallel. So what does a teacher do to facilitate the child's adjustment to the learning environment? When the child begins to cry because they're having some kind of separation anxiety on various levels, what does the teacher do to provide the reassurances? Es la misma cosa in working with acculturation stress.
Thank you, Dr. Trevino. We are seeing here the rituals produce courage, values, coping skills, reflect the style of thought, the systems of belief, the styles of life. What do you think?
Dr. Orovich?
Okay. Angel, could you repeat it?
Yeah, sure. The rituals produce courage, values, coping skills, reflect the style of thought, the system of beliefs, the style of life. What do you think?
I think they could, in terms of rituals, one of the things, the most important things that it provides is meaning, as we mentioned. So each ritual has a specific meaning. It allows you, if we're speaking about grieving processes, it allows the emotions to begin to move because we have a structure that has been taught to us that we have practiced in the past and that provides certain meanings. Like, for example, we mentioned how through the prayers of the rosary, you help your loved one move directly to heaven. So that's a very specific meaning of a ritual. And then in terms of the other thing that you mentioned was the spiritual beliefs. Is that the other? Is the other one in terms of spirituality is the way that we conceptualize a relationship maybe with a higher being and the practices that go along with those. Do you want to add something, Dr. Trevino?
I have some associations to when I heard the question and the comment. Rituals are culturally based. I agree with you. Rituals are based on systems of thinking, systems of thought, systems of cognitions, systems of beliefs. And I agree with you on that. And you see that in how the rituals are created, how they often use movement, how rituals often use music, how rituals often use food. All of that are expressions of tradition, and rituals capture those expressions of tradition, which reflect the system of thinking. I agree with you on that. The system of thinking, the system of knowledge that is needed to create change in a person, that informs the rituals. So a system of epistemology informs a ritual. They are traditions that contain, that give form to human experiences. that give form to transformative experiences. Let's just take a look at the baptism that is culturally based. It's also religiously based. And when we witness that, we begin to cry because we are in awe of the aesthetics of the divine. So it becomes not only a ritual, a religious experience, but a spiritual experience. Spirituality is defined as the belief that there is something that is greater than us in this universe. Every time we experience something that we are in awe, something that takes our breath away, is an ordinary spiritual experience. Rituals, by the nature of their containment, by the ability to transform experiences and create meaning and soothe an aching heart, is spiritual, is transformative. Those were my associations to that.
I'm sorry, I was fighting with the mute button, but thank you, Dr. Trevino, for those wonderful comments, and also Dr. Orovich for that great answer. I have some more questions here, and one of them says, what are some resources for parents that have lost their children to gun/community violence, especially within disenfranchised communities?
I would turn to and Los Angeles has a lot of resources for parents that have lost their children to violence, have lost their children to medical illnesses. There is a great deal of support. And so for that, I would turn to you, because I'm a psychologist, I would turn to you to the LA County Psychological Association. Whatever county you live in has a psychological association. And that psychological association can easily be accessed through the internet. And in that psychological association, you have a list of resources and a list of agencies that also provide services in English and in Spanish and other languages that specifically deal to parents who are in grief. Okay, in every county, you also have the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists at the local chapter. If you're outside of California, you have those professional organizations that offer outreach to the community with specific needs. Those are the first places that I turn to. My professional associations found in every city and in every county in this country.
Yeah, so it is important to go locally to access the local resources depending on where you're at. But there are some resources, including support groups for parents who have lost their children to either disease or even gun violence. I know in St. Louis, Missouri, they have some resources and other places as well. So it is important to go locally to check those out.
I also refer you to the resources that Angel put up to preface his webinar. Those are very good resources.
I would like to remember participants that these slides will be available after this presentation in our website. So there you can access those resources that Dr. Trevino mentioned I presented at the beginning. We have a few more minutes for questions, so I wanted to present you with this one. How do you approach or assess an adult with Down syndrome when he has lost his girlfriend due to COVID-19? How does grief counseling help those with mental disabilities?
My first response to that, it would be quite challenging. I would need to assess the verbal skills of my patient, how fluent they are in their ability to express themselves verbally. That's one way. The other way is to recognize that a wounded soul is a wounded soul, regardless of one's cognitive ability. When one loves and one loses that love, the soul grieves. And so I would facilitate the expression of that through catharsis, simple rituals that I would co-construct with my patient. That patient has to be actively involved in constructing a simple ritual. One simple ritual to grieve a loss that might work with this patient with Down syndrome is to write a letter to the person that died. I want to write a letter to my love, and I'm going to tell her how my heart grieves, how my heart aches. And once that is written, I want to have that person read it to me. And when they're ready, we're going to mail it. And how are we going to mail it, Dr. Trevino? We're going to bring out an ashtray and we're going to burn it with a candle right next to it. We're going to send it off like that. Creating symbolism, simple symbolism, recognizing that the wounded soul is nevertheless a wounded soul. It grieves and it cries. That part, I have something in common with my patient who has Down syndrome. I know what it's like to lose someone. I know what it's like to love someone. I know what it's like to love someone who doesn't love you back. That's the human connection. And that's at that level is where I will intervene with my patient.
I would say that I agree with you, and that a therapeutic space might be as helpful as it might be for any other person, taking into consideration, as you mentioned, the way the person expresses themselves, if it's verbally, if it's through letters, if it's through art. So we will find different ways to allow the emotion to move again and to share those with the therapist.
Excellent. Thank you to you both for that excellent answer. We have some more questions through here. It says, if a 9-year-old girl who lost her father and does not want counseling, how can we help the mother to help the girl with her grief?
Dr. Orovich?
I would say to meet her where she's at and to validate her emotions at the time while opening door, and she will decide if she wants to or not at this time. So by that I mean you offer some options in counseling. One of the things that I have done with adolescents who are about therapy is sometimes we have done bit of an agreement. So we'll say, okay, let's do 3 sessions if they agree to that, of course. And then by the 3rd session, you'll let me know if you want to do another one. And that is one way to provide the space for the person to make their own decisions about the process, meeting them where they're at, and then promoting the development of the therapeutic alliance, which will hopefully then result in them wanting to come back.
My association to that question is that a 9-year-old girl is developmentally is able to understand the concept of death. That a 9-year-old girl developmentally is able to understand and feel the sensation of loss. She may not understand it the way an adult understands loss, but nevertheless, her cognitive ability is at that stage where she is beginning to understand abstract experiences, abstract concepts. If the child does not want to talk, if the child does not want to attend therapy, conceptualize that as the reaction to loss. That's how she reacts. That's her grieving process. She becomes defiant, she becomes oppositional, or she becomes ill, physically ill. If she becomes physically ill, refer her to a doctor, have her medically cleared. But the idea that loss that is unable to be processed and to be expressed then becomes somatized, becomes cathected onto the body. Now, I'll explain those conceptualizations to the mother. The mother, if the mother is the one that is voicing the child doesn't want to come, on some level, the mother is identifying with the child. She's giving voice to the child. After all, the maternal understanding of a child's emotion, there is no other like a mother. The mother intuitively understands what's going on with the child. So one of the ways that I can access that child is to rely on the psychodynamic concept of projection. If I ask the mother, why do you think the child is grieving the way she's grieving by not wanting to talk, not wanting to do this, not wanting to do that? I wait for the mother to explain to me. Mothers know, they have some idea. And so when the mother explains to me why the child is grieving the way she's grieving, I will comment to the mother and say, you have a very good understanding of your daughter, almost as if you understand and have the same feelings that your daughter has. So now the pressure is off the child and on to the mother for the mother to begin to grieve for the child and to talk about the changes that have occurred since the person has died. That's one way. Family therapy is the treatment of choice for children. Family therapy is the treatment of choice for children because of the deep dependency that they have on their parents. Parents know their children very well. Allow the parent to share what they think is going on, because most likely it's pretty accurate.
That sounds like a wonderful advice, Dr. Trevino. Thank you for it. We will like to, with the time remaining, we would like to address one final questions. We are sorry we can have time for more. We also have some more messages of thank you, great presentation. So I would like to convey those to you on a great presentation. The question reads, for both presenters, if we can't do much rituals and cultural celebrations, what can we do? Zoom is not enough. Sad face.
Can you repeat the question again, Angel?
Sure thing. For both presenters, if we can't do much rituals and cultural celebrations, what can we do? Zoom is not enough.
My response to that is the Zoom is your office. So there are a couple of things that I need to adjust. The handshakes are no longer possible. Ahorita no puedo saludar con la mano. Now that's a loss. That's a significant loss. Un saludo followed by personalismo, a formal type of informality. That part is not lost. And it can be experienced and it can be witnessed visually, which is sensorially. It can be experienced auditorily, which is, I don't even that's the word, but it's an auditory reception, which is sensory. Now, personalismo is still in existence. That doesn't go away. El cariño, the salutation, ¿cómo le va? ¿Cómo le ha ido? All of that stuff, your style does not go away. That's part of the ritual. Zoom is just the method through which we communicate with our patients. That's not the technique. That's not the ritual. Zoom is not the ritual. What is the ritual is that when your patients Zoom in and call you, that you pick up right on time. Mm-hmm. That when they Zoom in and they see you, Your background, who you are, is consistent. That's ritual. That's structure. That's being the constant object. That's
Reliable.
being the permanent object, reliable object. Como no? That's ritual. That doesn't change. That you end on time is part of the containment of ritual. That doesn't change. Zoom is just the method, right? It's just like the theory. It's just a way of focusing, but it's not the agent of change. Saludando, hasta la próxima vez, aquí nos quedamos. Que le vaya bien, que la cuide Guadalupe, señora. Okay, that type of salutation is ritualistic and culturally informed. That doesn't change. That remains. Zoom just opens up the window. That's very archetypal, by the way. That's another webinar on the symbolism of Zoom.
I don't have much to add to that. I think that you explained it perfectly. It's the transformation of it's the same elements, but they are transformed in some way through the virtual platforms. But yes, we still have personalismo, respeto, confianza. All of those are still present in the interaction with our clients, and it brings up new experiences as well. I have to say, I have been touched by some of my clients sharing their homes with me, like letting me know this is the space where I spoke that I spoke to you about when we were discussing such and such, and I have been given house tours by some, and that has been a new experience, and it has been it also promotes the therapeutic alliance in a different way.
Thank you once again to both of you for a great presentation and accommodating all these questions in a meaningful way that I know our participants will appreciate and will take into their practice. Before we conclude, we would like to once again mention that your opinion is very important to us, and you can let us know it through the survey that we are providing on screen. You can either scan with your code, with your phone, the QR code, or you can also access it through the Survey Monkey link that we have provided below. You can also, I would like to remind that you will also be receiving this presentation in the later days through the page of the event. On another note, we would like to once again thank you for joining us today, and we would like to present you with our next session for this Grief Sensitive Virtual Learning Institute that will be right after this presentation, and you can feel free to join in there as well. A reminder, once again, today's presentation and slides and the recording for it will be available on our website. And we would like to thank you once more for being a part of this event, and hope you guys all stay safe with your families. Have a great day.
Thank you all.